Something was already wrong before she said his name. I knew it when the shrine bells on the hotel roof rang half a beat late, as if the sound had to travel through water to reach the ballroom below. I knew it when the contract lanterns over the aisle flickered blue instead of gold, and nobody else seemed to notice. I knew it when the family registrar scanned my wrist seal, frowned, then smiled too quickly and waved me through without asking for the second verification. In our city, people trust systems before they trust their own eyes. That is how they survive. It is also how they get trapped. By the time the wedding procession music started, I had already counted 4 inconsistencies, 3 missing attendants, and 1 forged guild authorization attached to my bride's side of the seating ledger. I still walked to the altar. That part matters. People like to rewrite these stories after the damage is visible. They imagine the betrayed man must have known everything and chosen revenge from the beginning. That is cleaner. It makes the world feel governed by intelligence instead of attachment. The truth is less flattering. I saw enough to suspect a setup, and I went through with the ceremony anyway because I wanted one specific outcome to remain real. Her. Ayla in white lacquer silk, silver thread veil, hair pinned with moonstone combs her grandmother had worn before the flood riots. She stood at the head of the aisle under the suspended vow sigils, and for 1 second she looked exactly like the woman who had sat with me in a power-cut alley 3 winters earlier, sharing contraband noodles and laughing at my fake name. Back then she knew me as Cade. Everyone in that room knew me as Cade Marita, low-tier logistics clerk, independent contractor. A no major lineage, no voting weight in city guild councils. Safe enough to mock. Useful enough to marry into a merchant family trying to climb. No one in the room knew my legal name. That was by design. The officiant began the binding sequence, voice amplified through the vow array. Names, witnesses, lineage declarations, inheritance clauses. Standard upper district contract marriage format, dressed in flowers and music so the guests could pretend it was about love. In our district, marriage between houses is not a promise first. It is an instrument. Property rights, shipping routes, debt consolidation, ward access, dispute immunity. The vows are just the part people remember because they sound human. I kept my face calm and watched the overhead sigils rotate. 2 primary signatures ready. Witness channels open. Asset and lineage disclosures pending final consent. Pending. Good. That meant I still had room to move. Ayla's father, Dorian Vale. I sat in the front row with his usual expression, gentle, public, expensive. The kind of man who could ruin a neighborhood and still be thanked for redevelopment. To his right sat Councillor Hest, who controlled district customs inspections. To his left sat a guild broker from the East Rail Consortium. Political weight, trade weight, regulatory cover. Too much of it for a merchant wedding unless the ceremony itself was the deal. Then I saw the 5th inconsistency. The ring bearer approached the dais carrying the ceremonial bond case, but it wasn't the child listed on the ledger. It was an adult page from the Vale household staff, hands steady, sleeves cut to hide wrist marks. When he knelt, the latch on the bond case flashed a recognition sigil I knew very well. Black iris, split circle. House Arclight internal authentication. My family's private seal. I did not react. Years of training are useful for exactly this. The second your blood goes cold, your face must become ordinary. The officiant turned to Ayla first. Do you, Ayla Vale, enter this contract of mutual estate and personal oath? She said yes without looking at me. I watched her throat when she spoke. Tight, controlled, not happy. Not frightened enough for what came next. Then the officiant turned to me. Do you, Cade Marita? The west doors opened. No dramatic crash, no storm of guards, just a clean mechanical parting and a shift in the room's attention, like a school of fish turning on instinct. A man walked in wearing formal combat dress in obsidian blue. No mask, no apology. Sword at his hip with the peace knot untied. Riven Saul. If you've never dealt with guild enforcers, the name won't mean much. In the upper districts, it carried weight. Young, decorated, attached to private suppression contracts during the post-war stabilization campaigns. Efficient enough to be praised in public and feared in private. I had read his reports years before under a different desk, a different life. And I knew exactly how many neighborhoods resisted relocation after he arrived. He should not have been at my wedding. He should not have had a valid pass through the vow barriers. And he definitely should not have walked straight to the aisle as if the route had been cleared for him in advance. Murmurs spread. The officiant hesitated, hand hovering over the sigil console. The suspended vow array flickered and tried to recalculate guest priority. Ayla finally looked at me. Not guilty, not surprised, resolved. That was the moment the structure of the betrayal became visible. I heard Dorian Vale stand before I looked. "Riven," he said, loud enough to frame the intrusion as welcome. "You made it." Made it. So this was not an interruption. It was a reveal. Riven stopped at the foot of the dais and bowed only slightly, which in that room counted as a challenge. His eyes moved over me once, dismissive, then returned to Ayla. "I apologize for the timing," he said, voice calm. "But false contract filings become legally binding if you wait until the last line." The ballroom went silent. Even the string quartet cut off mid-note. The officiant looked from him to Dorian to me, already searching for the safest version of events. "Sir, if you are contesting a filing, that must be submitted through—" "I already did." Riven held up a shard plate tablet. "Registry priority stamped this morning. The bride cannot lawfully finalize a personal oath to Cade Merida because her prior exclusive bond declaration with me remains active." A small sound moved through the crowd. Not shock exactly. Recognition. They had expected scandal, and now they knew what shape it was. I turned to Ayla. She lifted her chin and removed her veil herself. If she had cried, pleaded, hesitated, any of it, the room would have split. Some would have backed her, some me, most Dorian. But she did not give the room uncertainty. She gave it a decision. It was never supposed to get this far," she said. Not to me, to the room. I felt something in my chest go very still. The officiant, now sweating visibly, tried to restore procedure. "Miss Vale, please clarify. Did you enter a prior private declaration with this man?" Ayla looked at Riven, then at me. Yes. One word, clean, public, final. Dorian stepped in before anyone could ask the obvious follow-up. "This is regrettable. A private understanding was expected to be dissolved before today. It appears there was a filing delay, an administrative issue, not malice." Administrative issue. My hand stayed folded. My pulse did not move. Years earlier, my instructors used to strike the table with iron rods while we gave testimony under pressure, teaching us that anger wastes detail. If you react too early, you lose the room and the data. So I collected data. Riven's blade knot untied. He expected resistance. An arclight seal on the bond case. Someone wanted my identity confirmed or accessed. Registry priority stamp this morning. Either real influence or forged with high-level backing. Ayla's line, "It was never supposed to get this far." She expected me to withdraw before vows, meaning the real plan required me present but compliant. Humiliated, perhaps. Discredited, ideally. Not yet sure why. The guests began whispering in clusters. Some pretended sympathy. Others were already composing versions of the story to sell before midnight. In a city where memory records can be bought and edited, the first narrative often becomes the legal one. The officiant looked at me carefully. "Master Morita, given the dispute, this ceremony must pause pending registry review." Pause. Another useful word. It preserved everyone's deniability. Riven stepped onto the first dais step and addressed me directly for the first time. "You can leave now and avoid a formal charge." His tone was controlled, almost courteous, which told me he thought the outcome was guaranteed. "Formal charge for what?" I asked. The question landed harder than if I'd shouted. Because I sounded calm. Riven met my eyes. "Fraudulent marriage by concealment of status. False claims regarding commercial capacity. potential guild misrepresentation. There it was. Not jealousy, not romance, asset crime. This had never been about Ayla choosing between men. It was about forcing a legal record in a public setting, then collapsing it to trigger penalties attached to my assumed identity. Someone wanted Cade Merida ruined on paper. The trouble for them was simple. Cade Merida wasn't real enough to ruin. I looked to Ayla again, because if I did this next part without giving her one final chance, I would carry the uncertainty longer than the anger. "Did you know they were going to charge me?" I asked. The room leaned in. Even people who disliked me wanted the answer. Ayla's composure faltered for the first time. She glanced at her father. A small movement, telling. "I knew there would be consequences," she said. "Did you know the bond case was tagged with ArcLight authentication? That made Dorian move. Fast. Enough. This is turning into spectacle." I ignored him. Ayla stared at me now, truly confused, because I had named something she did not recognize. "No," she said. "What are you talking about?" I believed her. Not innocence, not in full, but that part, yes. She was inside the plan, not at the center of it. Riven took another step. "You're done here." He reached for my wrist, likely intending to trigger a restraint sigil and let the room assume I resisted. I moved first. One turn, inside his shoulder line, no flourish, no strike. I caught his wrist and redirected his hand into the officiant's console. The restraint sigil discharged early and wrapped around the wrong target. Blue chains of vow light snapped around the bond case. The case split. What spilled onto the dais was not rings. It was a stack of sealed documents, 3 identity shards, and a black lacquer key marked with the ArcLight family crest. For the first time in the ceremony, the room made an honest sound. No one rehearses surprise well. Riven recovered quickly, ripping his arm free, but the damage was done. The documents had slid far enough for the top sheet to unfold, and the projection seal at the header lit automatically in response to the vow array. ArcLight succession contingency subject KL. ArcLight status unlocated / presumed non-compliant replacement narrative package. Morita Coverite. The projection hung in the air over the flowers for a full 2 seconds before Dorian shouted for the array to shut down. Too late. 20 recording lenses in the crowd had already captured it. I let go of Riven's wrist and stepped back as if I were the one startled. Not performance exactly. I had not expected the whole packet to be in the case. I expected one probe, a one identity key, maybe a blood strip. Not enough to expose their backup narrative in the middle of the vows, which meant one of 2 things. Either they were arrogant, or someone else packed the case. Riven looked at the broken documents, then at Dorian, and I saw genuine anger break through his composure. "You said this wouldn't surface here." Dorian's face hardened. "Then control it." Ayla went pale. "What is that name?" I answered before anyone else could. "Mine." Silence again, but a different kind. This one had weight. I bent, picked up the black lacquer key, and turned it in my hand so the crest faced the room. There was no point pretending now, not when the succession packet was already hanging in the vow light like a confession written by accountants. "My name," I said, "is Kale ArcLight." A counselor in the second row whispered an oath. The guild broker stood up too quickly and knocked over his chair. The officiant took one involuntary step backward. Because in this city, the ArcLights were not just rich. They were infrastructure old money relic charter signatories, the family that funded half the northern grid before vanishing from public power after the post-war consolidation. My death, if we are being precise, my disappearance, had been useful to several people. Dorian found his voice first, which is why he remained dangerous. There is no proof of that. I held up the key. Private inheritance key tier black. It opens only to direct biometric line holders or designated executors. You embedded it in a fraudulent bond case and brought it under a vow array calibrated to collect my blood and oath signature. Would you like me to explain why? Riven stepped between me and the crowd, hand near his sword. Don't. He meant don't continue. He also meant don't force him to choose a side in public before he had orders. Men like him survive on timing. I looked past him at the guests and spoke clearly, not loudly. Because today's wedding was not a marriage ceremony. It was an identity recovery trap. The Vail House filed a false marital contract through my cover identity, invited regulatory witnesses, then staged a public dispute to trigger registry review and extract hidden lineage markers under vow law. With this key and that packet, they could attach my legal existence to the Morita shell, claim concealment, and freeze any dormant Arclight holdings before I could contest. The room shifted from scandal to calculation. I could see it happen. Merchants counting exposure, council aides estimating how many laws had just been implicated, socialites deciding whether to look horrified or impressed. Ayla stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. Cade, Kale, what are you saying? Her voice was smaller now, stripped of ceremony. You lied to me. Yes, I said, truth for truth. If I was going to burn the room down, I was not going to stand in clean clothes while doing it. I used a cover name. I work logistics under Registry Shadow because my family's collapse was not an accident, and surviving out loud was a poor strategy. Her eyes flicked to her father, then back to me, and I watched the math change in real time. Pieces she had separated, my caution, my missing records, Dorian's interest, Riven's timing, began locking together. I didn't know about this, she said, and this time she was talking to me, not the room. I knew my father wanted the marriage because of your trade routes. I knew he wanted leverage. I didn't know he thought you were Arclight, I finished. That would have changed your answer? She opened her mouth, then closed it. That was answer enough, too. The vow array overhead crackled, unstable from the broken console and exposed documents. One of the suspended sigils dropped lower, spinning near my shoulder. If it touched blood while unanchored, the array could start binding random clauses to everyone within radius. The officiant saw it and finally did something useful, scrambling to engage manual dampers. Everyone remain still, he shouted. Do not speak any contract phrases. No one listened. The crowd erupted into overlapping voices. Questions, accusations, panicked legal disclaimers. Someone near the back started streaming commentary directly to a market channel. 2 security drones descended from the ceiling, scanned the dais, and immediately flagged the Arclight key with crimson priority markers. System response. Fast. I checked the exits. West doors blocked by private security. North corridor filling with hotel enforcement. South terrace likely open but exposed. The safe options were being removed in sequence. Riven saw me look and misunderstood. You're not leaving with that key. Then stop the drones, I said. His jaw tightened. Oh, I don't take orders from you. Then take them from the man who just set you up. That hit. His eyes cut to Dorian again, then to the exposed contingency packet. He had enough discipline not to show doubt for long, but I only needed one crack. Dorian raised both hands, trying to reclaim the room. This can still be resolved privately. Counselor Hest, if you would. Privately, Hest snapped. You brought a succession recovery package into a public vow chamber. Dorian didn't miss a beat. To verify the target before involving the council. Target. There was the real language. The nearest drone projected a restraint field toward the dais. I stepped sideways, using the toppled bond pedestal as cover, and the beam caught a floral arch instead. The arch burst into smoking silk. Guests screamed and surged backward, making the chamber worse. Riven swore and drew his sword, not at me, but at the drone. One clean, upward strike split the projector housing. The machine spun into the ceiling and dropped sparks into the aisle. That was the first thing he did all day that I respected. Everyone down, he shouted. Ayla flinched at the command but didn't move. She was still looking at me, veil in one hand, white silk stained at the hem where the smoking arch had fallen ash across it. Was any of it real? She asked. It was a cruel time to ask, and a very human one. I could have answered tactically. I could have said what would hurt most, or what would keep her out of the way. Instead, I gave her the only thing I still had that wasn't strategy. "Yes," I said. "That's why this works." Her face changed then, not into forgiveness, not even into grief exactly, more like impact after the sound arrives. The second drone switched to lethal deterrence mode. You can always tell because the warning tone disappears. Riven moved again, but this one had line of sight on the whole dais and a smarter angle. I threw the arclight key to my left as hard as I could. The drone tracked the key, reclassifying the object as primary target. The beam lanced after it, punched through the velvet side drape, and blew out a section of decorative wall. The guests panicked for real. People stampeded toward the East Service exits. The officiant crawled behind the sigil console. Counselor Hess shouted for district lockdown while trying to stay off camera. Dorian's private guards closed around him in a practiced shell. In 10 seconds, the wedding became what it always was underneath, an extraction event. I used the chaos. The arclight key had bounced off a support pillar and landed near the musician's platform. I vaulted the broken floral arch, slid under a collapsing ribbon frame, and grabbed it just as 2 hotel enforcers entered from the east with suppressor wands raised. "Cade!" Ayla shouted. Wrong name, wrong timing. It still pulled my head half a degree. And one enforcer's stun line clipped my shoulder hard enough to numb my arm. I hit the floor, rolled, and came up behind the cello stand while the second shot scorched the stage edge. Riven was already in motion, not chasing me, cutting through the enforcer's line to stop the drones from locking onto the crowd again. For a man I had every reason to hate, he was doing the math correctly. Dorian, meanwhile, was trying to leave, not through the obvious front, through the registrar's side door behind the witness benches, the route used for private settlement disputes. He had expected a legal mess, maybe even violence. He had not expected the contingency packet to expose itself or the room to fracture this quickly. If he reached a secure line first, he could spin the narrative, freeze channels, and file emergency claims before anyone verified the footage. I could not let him get that time. I cut across the aisle, a shoulder-burning, guests shoving past in both directions. A woman in pearl wards clawed at my sleeve and screamed that I had cursed the ceremony. Someone else tried to grab the key and got dropped by a glancing elbow before I even registered doing it. Human mess under pressure is ugly. There is no graceful version of surviving a rich room when it collapses. At the witness benches, one of Dorian's guards intercepted me, big, trained, contract scar on the neck. He swung a shock baton low, aiming to break my knee. I took the hit on the metal bench rail instead, sparks spraying across us, then drove the broken vow lantern stem I still had in my numb hand into the inside of his elbow. He lost grip for a second. That was enough. I stepped in, locked his wrist, and put his own baton into the floor seal. The active circuit backfired through his arm and dropped him. I reached the side door just as Dorian crossed the threshold. He turned in the frame, immaculate despite the smoke, and then looked at me with something close to regret. "You should have stayed hidden," he said. "No," I said. "You should have." I slammed the arclight key into the emergency registrar slot beside the door. It was a gamble. The slot was for certified line holders to file injunctions during active contract disputes. Most people never see one used. But vow law is old, and old systems respect old credentials more than status. The slot scanned, paused, then flooded the corridor in red light. Line holder authority verified arclight, tier black emergency injunction window open, 90 seconds. Every legal display in the ballroom flashed at once. Guests froze mid-run. The drones halted, forced into recording-only mode by injunction protocol. Dorian's expression finally broke. There are moments when power changes hands before anyone has actually moved. This was one of them. And I stepped through the side door into the registrar corridor and faced him while the countdown began overhead. "Since you wanted a public process," I said, "let's have one." He recovered fast, because men like him do. You can file nothing substantive with a field key and no counsel. True. I held up the contingency packet documents I'd grabbed from the dais in the scramble. But I can preserve evidence, freeze altered registry actions linked to my identity, and compel disclosure of all filings attached to Cade Morita in the last 12 months. That got him. Not the inheritance, the paper trail. Because if the Morita shell was used in more than this wedding trap, the injunction would drag up every linked transaction, shell imports, shadow tenders, bribed inspections, quiet land grabs, whatever he parked in the alias while assuming he'd control the reveal. Dorian's voice dropped. No performance now. You don't understand what opens if you do that. I know exactly what opens. That was not entirely true, but I knew enough. Behind him, through the fractured ballroom doors, I could see Ayla standing alone on the dais amid smoke, torn flowers, and hanging vow sigils. Riven stood between her and the immobilized drones, sword lowered but ready, looking like a man who had arrived to win one kind of operation and found himself inside another. The countdown hit 68 seconds. Dorian tried one last angle. If you file this, your identity becomes impossible to bury again. Every faction that profited from the Arclight collapse will know you're alive by nightfall. I assumed that when you put my name over the altar. His eyes narrowed. Then you're making this personal. I almost laughed. This was always personal, I said. You just thought only your side was allowed to treat it that way. I turned to the registrar console and began the injunction sequence. The interface unfolded in layers, each one requiring blood, voice, and lineage key alignment. My numb shoulders shook when I pressed my palm to the plate. The system took a thin sample, compared pulse patterns, and accepted. Old code, ruthless and exact. I entered 3 commands. Preserve all active vow chamber recordings, unedited. Freeze registry mutation on identities Cade Morita and Kale Arclight pending tribunal review. Compel disclosure of linked contract filings, beneficial ownerships, and emergency stamps authorized by Vale Holdings in the preceding 12 months. The console warned me the 3rd request would trigger reciprocal scrutiny on my declared line. I confirmed anyway. Dorian moved then, sudden and quiet, a narrow blade appearing from his sleeve. Not theatrical, professional. He wasn't trying to duel me. He was trying to cut my hand off the console before the final seal. Riven's voice hit the corridor first. Don't! He reached us an instant later, faster than I thought possible through the crowd, and caught Dorian's wrist mid-strike. The blade stopped 1 finger width from my hand. For a second, all 3 of us were locked there, my palm on the console, Dorian straining forward, Riven holding him back with a face gone flat and hard. You hired me to contain a fraud event, Riven said, each word precise. You did not disclose a succession trap or falsified evidence package. Dorian hissed, Stand down. Riven's grip tightened. No. The countdown hit 12 seconds. I finished the seal phrase. Kale Arclight, line holder authority, injunction affirmed. The registrar corridor rang like a struck bell. Red light turned white. Legal sigils spread out through the walls and into the ballroom floor, locking records, freezing streams, marking every witness device in range with preservation tags. People cursed as their feeds stopped accepting edits. The drones rotated and began high-integrity archival recording under court protocol. No one could clean this easily now. The injunction completed at 0. For one breath, nobody moved. Then the city answered. Every screen in the ballroom, the hotel lobby, and likely half the district switched to tribunal standby notices. External lines jammed under automatic review load. Sirens rose somewhere below, not police exactly. Registry enforcement. Slower, meaner. Dorian went still in Riven's grip and looked at me with a kind of focused hatred I trusted more than his polished smile. You have no idea what you just cost yourself, he said. Maybe. But I knew what I had cost him. Time, control, secrecy. And in our city, those are the only currencies that matter when old houses start eating each other. I looked past him once more. Ayla had not left. She stood on the ruined dais in her wedding silk, face pale, veil gone, watching as officers and drones and guests reorganized around a story none of them could contain anymore. She met my eyes across the smoke and noise, and whatever I might have said there, about lies, love, names, any of it, did not come. There was no room left for a clean sentence. I turned back to the corridor as registry boots hit the outer hall and the first tribunal wardens crossed the threshold, and I understood the shape of the next problem before they spoke a word. I had stopped the wedding trap. I had exposed my name. And by filing the broad disclosure, I had opened every sealed ledger tied to the alias I used to stay alive, including the ones I was still using. Registry wardens secured the ballroom in under 3 minutes, which told me 2 things. First, Dorian had not fully bought them. Second, someone else had already been watching the ceremony feed and pushed a priority flag the moment my injunction landed. That mattered. In our city, institutions do not move quickly unless speed serves an existing interest. I stood in the registrar corridor with my hands still on the console while white preservation sigils crawled over the walls and into the floor seams. The wardens came in through the East Hall in layered gray coats, face veils down, legal staves humming with non-lethal bind charges. No district insignia. Tribunal direct. Their lead officer scanned the corridor once, marked me, marked Dorian in Riven's grip, then looked at the console seal and changed posture by half a degree. Respect. Oh, or caution. With tribunal people, it looks the same. "Lineholder Arclight," she said. "Step back from the console." I did. The adrenaline drop hit as soon as I moved. My shoulder went from numb to burning, then to a deeper pain that made my fingers twitch. The stun line had done more than clip me. I ignored it because pain can wait if paperwork can't. The lead warden touched the console, read the injunction stack, and swore softly behind her veil. "You filed broad disclosure." "Yes." "Under active public disturbance." "Yes." Her eyes lifted to mine. "You understand this compels review on your line as well." I read the warning. She looked almost annoyed, as if she preferred hysterical nobles to injured men who knew what they had signed. Good. Behind me, Riven released Dorian only when 2 wardens took the older man into legal restraint. Dorian didn't struggle. He'd switched back to controlled expressions already, likely triaging which records mattered most and which proxies he still had beyond the freeze radius. Ayla reached the corridor as they secured him. She had a tear in the side of her wedding sleeve, smoke in her hair, and one cut across the back of her hand from shattered vow glass. She looked at her father in restraints first, then at me, then at the tribunal sigils sealing the registrar slot. "Is he under arrest?" she asked. The lead warden answered without warmth. "He is under inquiry and movement restriction pending record review." That was the tribunal version of not yet, but maybe. Ayla swallowed, then turned to me. "Kale." The sound of my real name in her voice should have felt like vindication. It didn't. It felt late. I could see the questions lining up behind her eyes, about the alias, about the years, about whether anything between us had been chosen freely. I had versions of answers for all of them. None of them would survive the next hour. "Yeah, don't say anything to me right now," I said, quieter than the room deserved. "Say everything to counsel." Pain crossed her face, then anger at the pain, which was at least honest. "You think I'm protecting him. I think your father built this ceremony as a legal trap, and you walked to the altar anyway." She flinched like I'd struck her. I hated that I noticed. I hated more that part of me still calibrated the force of my words around her. Riven stepped in before either of us made it worse. "Ayla, go with the wardens. Give a full statement before your family council reaches you." She stared at him now, betrayal shifting direction. "You knew?" His jaw tightened. "I knew enough to stop a false filing. I did not know he packed a succession packet into the bond case." "Did you know my father thought Cade was—" She stopped and corrected herself. "Kale Arclight?" Riven didn't answer immediately. That silence gave her the truth. She laughed once, short and ugly, nothing like the polished daughter the Vale House displayed at galas. "So I was the only one standing in that room who didn't know what wedding I was in." No one argued. The lead warden signaled 2 officers to escort her. Ayla let them take her 1 step, then looked back at me one last time. "There was a night in District 12, she said, voice steady by force, "when you told me your real life had too many locked doors. Was that true, or was that cover too?" I hadn't expected memory. Not then, not that one. "It was true," I said. She held my gaze a second longer, then went with the wardens. I watched her disappear into the white-lit corridor and felt exactly nothing useful. The lead warden finished locking the registrar console and turned to me. "You'll come with us as protected filer." "Protected from who?" Her eyes flicked toward Dorian and then past him. "Toward the ballroom where guests were being sorted into witness classes. If I start the list here, we'll miss the convoy window." Fair answer. I picked up the contingency packet from the side bench, where a warden had placed it under seal. "This comes with me. It comes under chain. Then put me in the same chain." Something like reluctant approval moved in her face. Done. We moved fast after that, because the tribunal doesn't stay still when highline inheritance and contract fraud overlap in public. Dorian was taken through a shielded route. Ayla and the officiant through witness processing. Counselor Hess tried to invoke committee privilege and got ignored. The guests were tagged, scanned, and separated from their devices. Riven was held for statement classification, then released into conditional cooperation status after the wardens verified his intervention against the drones. I was placed in a transport capsule with 2 legal officers, 1 medic, and a record clerk who looked 12 and never once looked up from his slate. Only when the capsule sealed and the hotel district dropped away beneath us did the medic force my shoulder still and cut the suit fabric around the burn. "Bad line contact," she said. "No spine hit. You got lucky." "No," I said, watching tribunal drones fan out over the district in geometric patterns. "I got noticed." She gave me a flat look that suggested she was not paid for philosophy and sprayed the wound anyway. From the capsule window, I could see the city at night, and once you've seen it from tribunal altitude, you stop believing in the stories districts tell about themselves. Rooftop shrines glowing beside antenna farms, luxury towers sharing grid lines with flood-walled housing blocks, market alleys lit by stolen current from municipal relays, ward nets over old neighborhoods where ghosts were officially categorized as electrical noise, because maintenance budgets are easier to pass than exorcism budgets. The city runs because everyone agrees on the version of reality that keeps contracts enforceable. Tonight, I had broken one of those agreements in public. The tribunal compound sat in the old Northern Exchange, a fortress of black stone and glass threaded with legal wards older than the post-war charter. They took my key, my blood sample, the contingency packet, and what remained of my patience. Then they put me in an interview room with no corners and a table that recorded pulse drift. Not an interrogation room technically, a deposition chamber. That distinction matters if you care how truth is packaged. 3 people entered after midnight: the lead warden from the wedding, a tribunal examiner named Soren Vey, and a woman in plain charcoal with no visible insignia who carried herself like she expected doors to open before she reached them. Soren introduced himself first, because men like him like sequence. "You filed an emergency injunction under Arclight Tier Black Authority. We have provisionally verified biometric line status. Before we proceed, state your name for the sealed record." I looked at the pulse table. It had already mapped my shoulder pain, elevated stress, and fatigue. "Kale Arclight," I said. "Cover registry aliases include Cade Marita and 2 logistics sub-IDs I'll disclose under protected schedule." Soren's stylus paused. "You're volunteering undeclared aliases before formal demand." I filed broad disclosure. I'm not wasting anyone's time pretending this ends small. The woman in charcoal finally sat. "That depends on how long your hidden ledgers are." There it was, the next trap shape, institutional this time. "Who are you?" I asked. Soren answered carefully. "Special Auditor Maris Kell, Civic Stabilization Finance." That was almost funny. The same civic umbrella under which half the post-war asset seizures had been laundered. Maris didn't smile. You triggered automatic review of all linked entities tied to an unlocated ArcLight line holder using active shell identities. This has implications beyond a failed wedding. I'm aware. No, she said, I don't think you are. She slid a slate across the table. On it were 3 frozen notices, each time-stamped within minutes of my injunction. Emergency hold, North Transit Relay bonds, provisional freeze, Harbor Grid maintenance escrow, dispute flag, ArcLight legacy trust fragments. I stared at the second line. Harbor Grid maintenance escrow was not supposed to connect to me. I built that structure through 2 intermediaries and a dissolved freight cooperative to keep current flowing to 3 low districts after a contractor collapse. Illegal? In parts. Necessary? Entirely. Maris watched me read. There it is, the expression. I looked up. You froze maintenance escrow on an active harbor grid? We froze disputed beneficial control pending verification. Which means subcontractors won't get paid by morning. Which means we stop funds from disappearing while this tribunal confirms whether you've been using shell entities to move legacy capital under false identity. I leaned back, shoulders screaming, and breathed once before I answered. If the harbor relays missed service rotation because your office wanted a cleaner financial map, District 9 loses flood pumps on the East Canal. Soren's eyes flicked to Maris. The lead warden stayed still. Maris folded her hands. Then perhaps you should disclose everything quickly. There it was. Not justice. Leverage. They weren't wrong to pull records. I had buried assets, moved funds, falsified identity layers, bribed inspectors, and routed relief payments through shell logistics to keep myself alive and to keep certain districts functioning when official contracts failed. I knew exactly how I looked on paper. The problem was that paper and consequence rarely arrive in the same room. I looked at Soren. How long until the freeze propagates fully? He checked his slate. 40 minutes for district-level payment interruption, longer for physical service impact. I did the numbers without meaning to. Night crew rotation at the East Canal begins before dawn. If relay techs don't get the release codes, they don't show. If they don't show and rain from the upper channels continues. I stopped. Not enough data. Panic is expensive. Maris tapped the slate. You can stop the escalation. By handing Civic Stabilization Finance a map of every alias and every line I used while your sister office tried to bait me into a marriage trap? Her expression sharpened just enough to confirm the word bait mattered. Vale Holdings is not my sister office, she said. Didn't say yours. Said your office's. Silence. Soren cut in before the room hardened further. We can sequence this. Immediate operational disclosures under seal for infrastructure continuity. Broader financial disclosures under council review. That protects districts and preserves tribunal chain. Maris looked annoyed, which meant he was right. The lead warden spoke for the first time since we sat. Do it. That reset the room. Practical authority outranking political appetite. I liked her more every minute, so I gave them the first list. Not everything. Enough. 3 shells linked to harbor maintenance escrow, 2 emergency code relays, 1 dead intermediary registrar who could no longer sign releases, a replacement verification phrase hidden in a grain shipment ledger because the official channel had been compromised 6 months earlier. Soren wrote fast, then faster. The clerk outside was called in, pale and blinking, out to run verification through sealed channels before the freeze hit operations. Maris listened without interrupting, but I could feel her collecting future knives. When the immediate continuity packet left the room under warden escort, Soren set down his stylus and looked tired for the first time. That likely prevents district service failure, he said. Now we continue. We continued until dawn. I gave them the structure of Cade Morita, how the alias was built from a dead registry lane after the post-war warehouse fires, how I entered logistics because logistics sees everything and is ignored by everyone with real power, how Vale Holdings first approached Cade through low-value freight and credit smoothing, then scaled toward personal integration once they confirmed I had access to shipping channels they could not account for. I did not tell them every person who helped me. Not because I am noble, because some of those people kept districts alive while houses played inheritance games. And the tribunal is excellent at punishing unsanctioned competence. They asked about my family collapse. I gave the public version and the missing parts. Arclight internal vote, partition pressure, forced asset restructuring under civic emergency laws, protective stewardship agreements that became permanent. My disappearance at 17 after an attack on a transit vault convoy I was not supposed to be on. The official death assumption that followed because bodies simplify succession. Maris asked, "Were you hiding from the factions that profited from the collapse, or from legitimate inheritance duty?" "Both," I said. That answer she respected. Near sunrise, the deposition paused when the lead warden received a live update in her ear. She turned to Soren. "Harbor relay stabilized. District 9 pumps remain online." I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Then she added, "Vale Holdings petition for emergency separation of Ayla Vale's witness status from family inquiry." Denied. I looked at the table. Human reaction arrives late sometimes. Relief for the pumps. A separate, meaner relief that Ayla had not been swallowed back into her father's legal shell before speaking. I kept both off my face, and failed at least one. Maris saw it. "You still care." I laughed once, exhausted. "I can file an injunction and still be stupid." No one in the room argued. They released me into restricted protective lodging by late morning, which is a polished phrase for a locked suite with decent coffee and 2 armed wardens outside the door. I slept for 90 minutes, woke to painkillers and 3 tribunal notices, and learned that my life had become public argument. News channels split instantly into camps. Hidden heir exposed at wedding fraud scandal. Arclight survivor or financial imposter. Veil ceremony incident triggers contract law crisis. The footage of the succession packet projection had leaked despite preservation locks, meaning someone in the ballroom had analog captured it before the tribunal seal propagated. Clean work. By midday, markets had paused trading on several legacy trusts. Guild forums were tearing apart VAL law procedures. District channels were more practical. They wanted to know whether the harbor pumps would keep running, whether wedding disruptions now counted as contract terrorism, whether the tribunal would freeze more maintenance funds chasing noble scandals. All fair questions. I was reading the 3rd notice when the wardens let Riven in. Conditional cooperation apparently came with corridor access. He entered without the sword and looked worse than he had in the maintenance chaos. Eyes bloodshot, knuckles split, formal coat replaced by plain gray issue. He stood until I pointed at the chair. "I expected a lawyer," I said. "You'll get one." He sat. "This is before the lawyers." "That sounds like a mistake." "Probably." For a few seconds, we just listened to the city noise through sealed glass. Tribunal lodging sits high enough that the sound arrives thin and delayed. Riven folded his hands once, unfolded them. I gave my statement, full version, about Dorian's filing request, the registry priority stamp, the scope of what he told me and what he didn't. "Why?" He looked at me like the question irritated him. "Because he used my commission to stage a false legal event and nearly got civilians killed when the drones escalated." "Not because he used Ayla." His jaw tightened. "Both can be true." "Fair." I set the notice slate aside. "What did she say?" He hesitated. "I'm not supposed to discuss witness statements." "You came here before the lawyers to respect procedure?" A tired breath that was almost a laugh. She stated she believed the ceremony was a pressure tactic to force you into withdrawal and public embarrassment, not an identity trap. She admitted a prior private declaration with me. "Oh, she admitted concealing that from you." He held my gaze. "She denied knowledge of the succession packet." I looked out the window. That matched what I believed, which was annoying in a way anger can't fix. Riven continued, more carefully now. "She also said her father had been tracking irregularities in your records for months and told her if she ended the engagement privately, you might retaliate through trade channels." I turned back to him. "And she believed that." She believed he could destroy her family if she misplayed the timing. He paused. People raised in houses like that don't always know where choice ends and obedience begins. I almost snapped at him for defending her, then stopped because he wasn't defending what she did. He was naming the mechanism. He looked down at his split knuckles. I'm not here to ask you to forgive anyone. Good. I'm here because the tribunal is looking at Vale, at your aliases, and now at every suppressed line connected to post-war succession seizures. If the wrong people panic, this stops being a legal scandal and starts being cleanup. There it was, the larger war edge. Who's moving? I asked. He met my eyes. House Corvin petitioned for an emergency audit exemption this morning. East Rail Consortium purged 6 years of private dispatch logs overnight. And someone tried to breach tribunal witness transport routing at 4:12. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something clean and simple. Not fear, direction. They're not reacting to me exposing my name, I said. They're reacting to the disclosure range. Yes, because if Vale used the Morita shell for more than this trap, and broad disclosure pulls linked beneficial ownerships, then the tribunal's financial graph starts connecting shells across houses. Riven nodded once. That is the concern. Concern, another polished word for panic among expensive people. I stood too fast, shoulder flaring. The room tilted, and then steadied. I need access to the disclosure index. You won't get open access. Then supervised. He didn't answer. I looked at him. Why are you really here, Riven? This time the pause was longer. When I was 19, he said, I ran suppression on a relocation corridor in West Harbor under civic warrant. The warrant was lawful on paper. The casualty revisions after were also lawful on paper. I signed off because that was the system. He tapped the notice slate lightly. This feels like that. Too many clean words around ugly machinery. I believed him. Not redemption, not absolution, just recognition. So, I asked, so I can get you into an evidentiary review room before the lawyers turn this into a month of motions while records disappear. I stared at him for 1 second too long, then grabbed my coat. The tribunal review room was smaller than I expected and more dangerous. Not physically, legally. 6 secure terminals, layered recording seals, one wall of live linkage maps projecting relationships between entities, identities, trust fragments, emergency stamps, and contract events. It looked like a scholar's tool. It functioned like a weapon. A tribunal clerk supervised us with the expression of a man who deeply regretted every career choice that led to this room. I logged in under restricted filer status and pulled the first wave of linked disclosures attached to Cade Merida. The list kept scrolling. Freight arbitration shells, yes. Harbor maintenance escrow, yes. Vale procurement consultancies, yes. But also dormant trust bridges tied to post-war asset conversion courts. Land transfer proxies in flood-rezoned districts. Emergency reconstruction bonds with identical legal language across competing houses. A lattice of shell entities designed to look unrelated while feeding into a handful of stabilized funds. Maris had been right about one thing. The implications were wider than a wedding trap. And then I saw the line that changed the shape of the entire thing. Replacement narrative services, civic continuity communications, archived vendor. Subcontract channel V, holdings/E, rail/Corvin civic deliverables, casualty harmonization, registry identity smoothing, witness profile suppression, casualty harmonization. I felt my mouth go dry. Riven read over my shoulder and went still. That phrase isn't public. No, I said. It's what they call memory laundering when they need legal records to match politically acceptable outcomes. The clerk looked up sharply. That's an allegation. I pointed at the screen. That's a billing term. He read it, blanched, and started typing a flag request with trembling fingers. The linkage map on the wall reconfigured as the system incorporated the new node. Lines shot outward. Vale, Corvin, East Rail, civic finance subcontractors, defunct registry offices, private security retainers, post-war relocation authorities. And there, and half hidden under 2 dissolved entities and a tribunal-sealed archive tag, was a record I had not expected to survive. ArcLight Convoy Incident Review. Supplemental Witness Status Incomplete Subject C. ArcLight Disposition. Unconfirmed death/narrative pending. Narrative pending. Not dead, not lost. Pending. For 7 years I had lived under shadow identity because I believed my disappearance had forced their hand and made me hard to classify. But the system had never failed to classify me. It had simply left the file open while deciding which story to finalize. My cover life, my secrecy, the wedding trap, the sudden pressure from Vale. None of it was random timing. Someone had restarted an old process. Riven read the same line and swore under his breath. They were waiting. For what? The clerk asked. I answered before I thought it through. For an ArcLight line holder to surface with enough attached shell activity to justify a public fraud narrative instead of a succession dispute. The clerk stared at us. You mean? I mean, if the wedding trap worked, I said, hearing it clearly now. They don't just discredit me. They fold me into a criminal shell identity, freeze every claim I could make, and preserve the post-war transfers as good faith redistribution. No inheritance war, no review of old seizures, no surviving heir, just a con man exposed at his own wedding. The room went very quiet. Even Riven had nothing for a moment. The clerk's terminal chimed with the tribunal priority response. He read, went pale, and looked at me. Special Auditor Maris Kell has petitioned immediate expansion of your protected filer status to provisional state witness. I laughed once. Now she wants to protect me? Riven looked at the linkage map, not at me. No, she wants to keep the graph intact. He was right, and it didn't matter. A motive is a luxury when bullets and warrants share a schedule. The clerk swallowed. There's more. Tribunal witness transport route breach at 412 has been linked to a contractor node now flagged in your disclosure set. Which witness? I asked. The clerk checked, hesitated, then answered. Ayla Vale. The floor seemed to shift under me even though nothing moved. Riven was already on his feet. Where is she now? Protected lodging, location sealed. Then why was there a transport route loaded at 412? The clerk's fingers shook over the slate. Pre-transfer prep maybe, I don't know. Maybe. In tribunal language, that often means someone used a real process to hide an unauthorized one. I looked at the map again, at the lines converging around narrative smoothing firms and witness profile suppression, and the next decision arrived before I could pretend I was making it calmly. If the same network that built the wedding trap now believed Ayla could complicate their preferred story, her statement was not a side detail. It was a threat vector. I straightened, shoulder protesting hard enough to spark black at the edges of my vision. I want her moved under tribunal direct. No subcontracted transport. The clerk blinked. You can't order that. No, I said. But I can flag credible risk based on disclosed contractor overlap and witness suppression billing tied to this case, right now, on record. If something happens after that, your names are in the review chain. The clerk looked like he hated me for being correct. He opened the flag form. Riven had already pulled a terminal and was routing his conditional cooperation credential through security liaison. I'll push it from the enforcement side. The clerk looked between us. You two were trying to kill each other at a wedding 6 hours ago. Riven didn't glance up. No, we were being used at a wedding. That line stayed with me. Within 11 minutes, the tribunal issued an emergency witness custody revision. Ayla's transport was canceled, and her lodging detail upgraded from contracted security to internal wardens. The route breach inquiry expanded. 3 contractor badges were invalidated. 1 supervisor failed check-in and went missing. Not a tidy win. A delay. Sometimes delay is the only thing you get. By evening, my lawyer finally arrived and hated everything I had done before meeting him, which means he was competent. He spoke in controlled fury for 20 minutes about exposure, admissions, sealed liabilities, and the difference between moral righteousness and survivable litigation. I let him finish because he was right about most of it. Then I showed him the narrative smoothing record and the convoy file tag. He stopped talking. "Can we blow this open?" I asked. He considered the map, the tribunal notices, my disclosures, the timing. "Oh, not cleanly," he said. "Not quickly, and not without risking the districts you've been illegally funding. Can we survive it?" He looked at me for a long moment. "If you stop improvising in ballrooms, possibly." That was as close to optimism as I was going to get. The tribunal process ran for 6 more days before the first public rulings, and in those 6 days, the city changed its story 3 times. First, I was a fraud, then a hidden heir, then a criminal lineholder whose illegal shells accidentally exposed a larger fraud network. All 3 versions were useful to someone, which is how you know none of them are complete. Dorian Vale was formally charged on contract fraud, evidence manipulation, and unlawful registry interference. Not convicted, charged. He smiled in the courtroom footage because men like him know charges are weather, not fate. Counselor Hest resigned pending review. East Rail denied knowledge of narrative smoothing subcontract terms and then quietly fired 2 executives. House Corvin secured a temporary audit exemption through a judge whose cousin happened to hold Corvin dead, which told me the machine was still very much alive. Ayla testified under sealed session and was released under monitored status, separated from Vale legal strategy. We did not speak. Riven filed for suspension from private suppression work. Half the channels called it conscience. The other half called it positioning. They were both probably right. As for me, the tribunal recognized provisional standing on the ArcLight line and froze final inheritance action pending full historical review. I was not restored. I was not cleared. I was not safe. I was, in legal terms, an interested surviving party under disputed continuity. Which is an elegant way to say they had to keep me alive while deciding what version of me the city could afford. The wedding flowers were gone by then. The hotel reopened under a temporary name. People still posted fragments of the ceremony online, slowed down and analyzed frame by frame like a duel match, trying to catch the exact second the story changed. Most of them picked the projection of my name over the altar. They were wrong. It changed earlier, in the moment the bond case split and the room saw paperwork where rings should have been. That was the truth of it. Not romance breaking, not vengeance landing, a machine misfiring in public. Weeks later, after the first hearings and the second wave of freezes, I went back to the rooftop shrine above the hotel alone. The bells were repaired. The city sounded normal from that height. Traffic, rail hum, distant vendors, wind-crossing antenna wire. Normal is a sound engineers and priests both know how to manufacture. I carried no flowers. I was not there for closure. In the shrine offering box, someone had left a moonstone comb with 1 broken tooth. No note. I stood there a long time with the comb in my hand, and the city spread below me in lights and lies and functioning pumps, and I understood something I should have known sooner. I had not ruined them. Not completely. Not yet. I had interrupted 1 operation, exposed 1 set of ledgers, and forced a tribunal to look at records it preferred to index quietly. I had also burned my cover life, tied my surviving districts to my name, and stepped back into a family war that had spent years preparing a story for my death. The machinery was still running. It had just learned I could see the gears. When I finally left the shrine, the bells rang again, this time on time, and I hated how much that unsettled me.